Trump's latest outburst over Iran and another failed ceasefire attempt comes at a moment when a fast escalating war is reshaping Middle East security, global markets, and great power politics. In this video, we break down what is actually happening, why Washington and Tehran keep talking past each other, and what the repeated rejection of a ceasefire could mean for the region and the world. Let's start with the key development. In early March 2026, as the US and Israel-led war in Iran moved into its second week, President Donald Trump publicly ruled out any negotiated settlement short of what he called Iran's unconditional surrender. He coupled that demand with sweeping rhetoric about eliminating much of Iran's current leadership and then helping to rebuild the country afterward, framing the campaign as both a military effort and a promised future reconstruction project. This hardline came against the backdrop of mounting international pressure for a ceasefire, or at least a pause in the fighting, after Iran's leadership was decapitated, the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted, and missiles were flying across the region. Yet Washington, Israel and Tehran have all, in different ways, resisted the ceasefire formulas put forward so far, meaning multiple attempts at a truce have stalled or collapsed. In other words, when we say ceasefire rejected again, we are talking about a situation in which outside mediators and some UN members are pushing for a halt, but the main combatants still see more to gain or less to lose by continuing the war than by stopping it on current terms. Now, to really understand why Trump's reaction has been so sharp, we need to step back and look at how we got here. For decades, tensions between the United States and Iran have cycled between confrontation and uneasy de-escalation, centered on three big issues: Iran's nuclear program, its regional network of allied groups such as Hezbollah and various Iraqi militias, and its opposition to Israel's existence and regional US influence. The 2015 nuclear deal temporarily curbed aspects of Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief, but Washington's withdrawal from that agreement under Trump's first administration and the re-imposition of sanctions reunited confrontation and sidelined diplomatic channels. In the years since, the conflict gradually spread from shadow warfare, covert strikes, cyber attacks, and proxy clashes to more open exchanges between Israel and Iran, including attacks on nuclear sites and missile and drone strikes in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. By mid-2025, as Israel and Iran exchanged blows and the Gaza conflict added more layers of tension, Trump publicly claimed to have brokered a complete and total Israel-Iran ceasefire, but neither Tehran nor Tel Aviv formally confirmed that announcement. And fighting and covert operations continued in various forms. That fragile landscape collapsed in early 2026. In late February, Israel, with US support, launched what has been described as the largest air operation in its history, hitting hundreds of military targets inside Iran under the codename Operation Roaring Lion. Israeli jets and US aircraft struck air defences, missile launch sites and naval vessels, aiming to degrade Iran's ability to project force and retaliate against Israel and US forces in the region. Iran hit back with large salvos of ballistic missiles and drones targeting Israel, US bases across the Gulf, and even civilian infrastructure such as airports and ports in several regional states. The escalation also saw Iran close the vital Strait of Hormuz, at least temporarily, disrupting global oil and gas flows and immediately alarming energy markets. Inside Iran, the leadership crisis deepened. Strikes against Iranian command targets led to the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, triggering the creation of an interim leadership council headed by senior official Ali Larijani. Larijani publicly accused the US and Israel of trying to dismantle Iran as a state, and Iranian officials warned that any further Western military involvement, including from Europe, would be treated as an act of war. At the same time, Iran's allies got drawn in more deeply. Hezbollah in Lebanon stepped up attacks on northern Israel, launching drones and missiles at Israeli bases, while an Iraqi faction calling itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq claimed strikes on targets in the Kurdish city of Erbil, where US and allied forces have a presence. This turned the Iran conflict from a bilateral clash into a multi-front regional war involving state and non-state actors across the Middle East. Against this backdrop, calls for a ceasefire grew louder. Regional powers like Qatar, Oman and Egypt, European governments deeply worried about energy supplies and refugee flows, and UN officials have all signalled the need for at least a temporary halt to avoid a wider regional conflagration. Some of these states had already been involved in earlier ceasefire or de-escalation efforts, including the Gaza ceasefire in October 2025, which analysts argued could open the door for a broader diplomatic track involving Iran. Yet even as indirect talks between the US and Iran had taken place in Geneva on nuclear and regional issues, the military tempo increased rather than slowed, suggesting that diplomacy and deterrence were operating in parallel rather than as substitutes. Once major strikes began inside Iran, the political costs of backing down rose sharply on all sides, making any ceasefire proposal much harder to sell domestically in Washington, Tehran or Jerusalem. This is the context in which Trump's latest comments landed. Recently, Trump has sent several strong and sometimes mixed messages. On one hand, he has told allies and markets that the war in Iran could end very soon and has described US President operations as achieving tremendous success on the ground, signaling confidence that core military objectives are within reach. On the other hand, he has insisted that the United States will not accept anything short of unconditional surrender from Tehran, explicitly rejecting the idea of an interim ceasefire or partial political settlement. In an interview and social media style statements, Trump vowed there would be no agreement with Iran except for UN conditional surrender and floated the idea of effectively clearing out a large amount of leadership in Iran and then guiding the creation of what he portrayed as new, more capable leaders. He promised that, with US and allied help, a post-war Iran could become larger, better and more robust than ever before economically, framing the conflict as a pathway to rebuilding rather than simply regime change. Supporters see this rhetoric as a negotiating tactic designed to maximise pressure and deter further Iranian escalation. From this perspective, rejecting ceasefires now is not about rejecting peace in principle, but about making sure that any pause does not give Iran time to regroup militarily or politically. Proponents of the hardline argue that Iran has often used ceasefires and de-escalation periods to rearm and entrench its regional networks, and that only decisive military pressure and clear red lines will change Tehran's calculations. They also point to Iran's continuing missile and drone attacks on Israel and Gulf states and its threats against European military involvement as evidence that Iran is still on an escalation path that cannot be managed through partial deals. Critics, however, warn that this approach risks locking all sides into a long war with spiralling costs and uncertain outcomes. Many analysts note that Iran, despite heavy damage, has not collapsed and still maintains the capability to strike regional economic hubs and shipping lanes. They argue that demanding unconditional surrender from a large, populous country with a strong sense of national pride is unlikely to be realistic, and that it can reinforce hardliners in Tehran who oppose any compromise and portray the conflict as an existential defense of Iranian sovereignty. Some experts also worry that promising to restore Iran under new leadership may feed perceptions, both inside Iran and across the global south, that the war is at least partly about externally engineered political change, not just security concerns. That, they say, could undermine international support for the US position over time, especially among countries already sceptical after years of sanctions and previous interventions in the region. Iran's own messaging has been equally uncompromising. Officials on the Interim Leadership Council have framed the conflict as a joint US-Israeli attempt to break up the country and have warned domestic groups against secessionist moves, suggesting real concern about fragmentation under wartime pressure. Iranian commanders have threatened to hit all economic hubs in the Middle East and have made clear that they consider even defensive European actions on behalf of allies to be acts of war. At the same time, there have been reports that some Iranian figures were interested in talks or deconfliction channels, including earlier periods when Trump claimed that Iran wanted negotiations, but that it was too late because US-led strikes had already intensified. From Iran's perspective, many ceasefire proposals appear to come with conditions it sees as unacceptable, such as far-reaching constraints on its missile program and regional relationships, areas it views as core to its security strategy. Israel's position adds yet another layer. After absorbing Iranian missile attacks and facing increased fire from Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israeli leaders have warned that their strikes could deepen and even include broader ground operations against Iran-aligned groups. They see Iran's nuclear and missile programs, plus its support for armed groups on Israel's borders, as existential threats that justify sustained offensive action rather than limited retaliation. For Israel, a ceasefire that freezes the situation without significantly degrading Iran's capabilities may look like a short-term safety net, but a long-term strategic defeat. That helps explain why some ceasefire concepts, especially those that would quickly lift certain military pressures on Iran, face resistance in Israeli political and security circles. So where does this leave international efforts to stop the fighting? So far, attempts at ceasefires or pauses have been hindered by three main gaps. First, there is a gap in war aims. Washington and Israel talk about dismantling much of Iran's military and leadership capacity, while Tehran talks about surviving, maintaining territoria, integrity and preserving its regional role. Second, there is a sequencing gap. Outside mediators often push for an immediate ceasefire followed by talks, but the main combatant want political or security guarantees up front before easing military pressure. Third, there is a trust gap. Years of broken agreements, covert actions and sanctions have left all sides deeply skeptical that any deal will be honoured once the immediate crisis passes, for example. Earlier claims of ceasefires or de-escalation arrangements, including Trump's 2025 announcement of a supposed Iran-Israel truce that neither party confirmed, have made it harder for publics and elites to believe new announcements without concrete, verifiable steps on the ground. This is why Trump's sharp rejection of new ceasefire ideas matters beyond the domestic political theatre. It signals to Iran and the wider world that Washington is not yet ready to trade battlefield momentum for diplomatic uncertainty. It also tells allies and competitors that, at least for now, the US strategy is to keep pushing militarily to force a more favourable negotiating position rather than to lock in an imperfect status quo through a rushed truce. The global consequences of this approach are already visible. Energy markets are among the most immediate channels of impact, with Iran having closed or severely the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant share of the world's oil and gas exports usually pass. Prices and volatility have risen, and traders are watching every statement from Washington, Tehran and regional capitals for clues about how long the disruption will last. Trump's suggestion that the war could end very soon has offered some reassurance, but without a concrete ceasefire or clear timeline, uncertainty remains high. Beyond energy, global shipping and insurance costs have gone up, particularly for routes passing near the Gulf and the Arabian Sea, as companies factor in the risk of missile or drone attacks on ports and vessels. This feeds into broader inflationary pressures worldwide, especially in energy importing regions like Europe and parts of Asia, at a time when many economies are still dealing with post-pandemic and post-Gaza conflict disruptions. Security alliances are also being tested. NATO members and other US partners are balancing support for Washington and concern about being drawn into a wider conflict if Iranian threats against European or regional bases materialize. Some European policymakers are pushing harder for diplomacy, in part to shield their economies and in part to avoid another long, open-ended military engagement after years of involvement in the Middle East and war in Ukraine. For Russia and China, the conflict presents both risks and opportunities. They have criticized US and Israeli strikes and called for restraint, while also exploring ways to position themselves as alternative partners for Gulf states seeking to diversify security relationships. At the same time, they must weigh the benefits of US AG, distraction and higher Western energy costs against the risk that an out-of-control war could destabilize the entire global economy, including their own exports and investment plans. In the broader global south, Trump's rejection of ceasefires and his talk of reshaping Iran's leadership feed into long-standing debates about sovereignty, intervention and double standards. In international politics, some governments see the US stance as consistent with its security commitments to Israel and its Gulf partners. Others view it warily recalling. past interventions in Iraq and Libya, and worrying that they could set precedents for future conflicts. Humanitarian concerns are another major dimension, with strikes hitting not only military targets but also infrastructure and economic hubs. Civilians in Iran and neighbouring countries face disruptions to electricity, water, health services and basic supplies. International agencies are warning of potential displacement and refugee flows if fighting continues or intensifies, particularly from regions close to the front lines or heavily targeted by airstrikes. Repeated failure to secure a ceasefire, whether temporary or comprehensive, makes it harder for aid agencies to plan and operate and raises uncomfortable questions about how to balance military objectives with the protection of civilians. This is why many humanitarian and human rights organizations are pressing all sides, including the United States and Iran, to accept at least time-bound pauses to allow relief operations, prisoner exchanges, and evacuation of the wounded. For ordinary people outside the region, the conflict may feel distant, but its ripple effects touch daily life through fuel prices, food costs, and the broader climate of geopolitical tension. If the war drags on, it could crowd out international attention and resources from other crises, from climate change to development funding, and deepen divisions in global forums like the UN and G20 over questions of war, peace, and the use of force. So, what should we watch next? First, pay attention to any shift in rhetoric from Trump, key US officials, Iranian leaders or Israeli decision makers that might indicate a willingness to move from maximalist demands toward phased arrangements, even small changes in public language, such as talk of temporary pauses, humanitarian windows or sequenced steps, can signal behind the scenes discussions about possible off-ramps. Second, watch the battlefield. If Iran's capacity to launch new large-scale attacks significantly declines, or if the costs of continued fighting mount through casualties, economic disruption or domestic political pressure, leaders may find it harder to justify rejecting ceasefire initiatives. Conversely, if Iran or its allies manage to inflict more serious damage on US or Israeli targets, that could either harden positions further or create incentives to avoid an even riskier escalation. Third, look to the mediators, regional powers that maintain channels with both Washington and Tehran, along with UN. And European diplomatic efforts could craft more nuanced proposals that address at least some of each side's core concerns, from security guarantees to economic relief. But any such plan will have to navigate domestic politics in all capitals, including in the US, where Trump's assertive stance on Iran has become part of his broader image of strength and resolve. In the meantime, Trump's forceful rejection of another ceasefire attempt and his insistence on unconditional surrender underscore just how far apart the main actors remain. The war in Iran is not only a regional showdown, it is a test of how the international system handles high-stakes conflicts involving major powers, contested regimes, and critical global choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. We will continue to track the diplomacy, the military developments and the economic fallout as this crisis evolves, and to bring you clear, fact-based analysis without spin. You've been watching Global Briefing. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll see you in the next report.